Hello. So I'm, like Mike and Julie introduced us, I'm Jeet Shroff. I'm the gameplay director at Santa Monica Studio, and I was the gameplay engineering lead on God of War.
And I'm Dan Lowe. I'm a senior technical animator at Motive Studios in Montreal.
So we are super excited to be here. We're going to talk a lot about techniques, ideas, philosophies, systems that make sort of animation amazing, and get it all realized and into the hands of players, and how they feel it on the sticks. And we have obsessed about these problems for most of our careers. So it's great to share and talk about them in this segment. How they do that? How did we do that? This is going to be sort of a free-form conversation where Dan and I will break down a few segments and analyze videos from games from the last year. And we will also be taking questions throughout the chat, and we'll hope to answer some of them at the end. And we have a lot of stuff to get through, so...
It's true, yeah. I've cut together kind of like a lot of videos from a lot of different games. And because of that, because it's a free-form conversation, we don't know how much of that exactly we're going to get through. So if you see kind of like that there's a bunch of stuff that we're not getting to, I'm probably going to put a video together and post it up on YouTube that covers kind of all of this stuff as well. So we'll see how much we get through. And I think the first one that we wanted to talk about was, we've got kind of like Jeet here, was to talk a bit about God of War and some of the stuff you guys were doing last year. And specifically, like, there was a few topics that kind of came to mind with this that kind of really stood out from this game. And the first one that we wanted to talk about was the one-shot camera, which I guess people have talked about quite a bit. With this.
Yeah. I mean, like, with Corey's vision for this thing, it was this idea of really blending gameplay narrative completely and making it very seamless and sort of have this very documentary-style feel to the way players were witnessing the world, seeing Kratos, and seeing sort of everything kind of, reveal itself. And this was a huge challenge, not even just from sort of a loading point of view, but also from an animation and cinematic workflow.
Yeah. So I've cut together some videos that are kind of looking at sort of some of the different transitions that happen when you go from cinematics to gameplay. To start off with, this one is kind of like looking at, you're in a cinematic already, you have to transition directly into gameplay. I would assume that this is probably one of the more simpler kind of like transitions because you sort of know where you're kind of going to. But I wanted to ask about, during cutscenes, you could very easily kind of change the state that the character is in, right? Like you could have Kratos draw his axe, or you could put him into a combat state. So I wanted to ask you kind of like, what were some of the sort of challenges that you guys were hitting with that kind of stuff, and or some of the things that you were having to look at?
Yeah. Like on the outro side, so let's kind of frame this as outros where you're leaving the cinematic and you're going back into gameplay. So one of the key things, obviously, you need to worry about is this idea of like, when does the player really know that they're back in control? And so we kind of tried to hit a key pose in animation where we called it sort of the cinematic idle. So it wouldn't really be the combat idle.
Right.
It'd be this it's like a slightly different pose where he'd be standing a little bit more upright, a little bit more calmer, given that he'd just finished a sort of cinematic, depending again on what the content was. And then the camera would kind of settle back in slowly. And then once sort of the camera was getting kind of very close to what game camera would look like, we kind of made it a rule where we were like, that's when you have to give control back. Right? So then from a sort of cinematic language point of view, the players would know like, okay, this is the point where I have control back. And then we
wanted to make that really obvious.
Yeah, we didn't really want to be like players just kind of sitting around waiting and assuming that the cinematic is still going on. And then, Atreus, who's the companion character, kind of helped a lot with that, where you'd have him kind of come on frame or kind of get in front and then kind of look back at you, and then you'd be like, oh, okay, it's my turn now. It's my turn to kind of engage again. And then, kind of how you're mentioning in terms of what you could do in the cinematic. So given that like gameplay and narrative are kind of blended this way, it was important for us to kind of keep the game running throughout the cinematic.
Right.
So what I mean by that is like every system that we would probably have running during regular gameplay is running during the cinematic. And then we can choose via script, what systems are on or off, and during the cinematic, they blend in or they blend out. So things like, collision with the environment, things like IKing the feet on the floor, weapon systems. So like, is the weapon in his hand? Is it completely cinematic driven? Is it on his back? Like, what is the state of the weapon? Having all those systems running at the same time allows you then to make these kind of very nice handoffs where you're not going to kind of see glitches or pops.
Right.
And even then, we had certain systems that just didn't follow that rule, right? So like our attachment system was one of the things that kind of was very gameplay centric, and that's one of the things that we probably improve on, where like attachments that aren't dynamics, right? Like Mimir's Head is a good example. They would we'd have to kind of make sure he might be kind of off screen or something like that before he kind of comes back into frame. So there's also those sort of very smoke and mirror tricks that we'd also use to kind of hide off some of the bad transitions that you might notice.
Right. So related to that, I've just kind of like pulled up this video where you see that as kind of Kratos gets into this, it triggers this transition. He's then sort of immediately putting this kind of prop on his back. So I guess that has to be sort of like built into the. Would you do that with a kind of tagging system, or is this kind of is there a separate system that's kind of built in? And then the same when he's coming out of this transition, he's now taken Atreus' bow and slung that over his shoulder. So is this done with tags? Is this the cinematic itself is almost kind of like its own track that has that information in, or is this embedded into Kratos' animation and Atreus' animation separately?
Yeah, like I guess there's many ways you could do it. The way we chose to do it was to handle it kind of in the level script side. So like as the cinematic is actually being integrated and put in, and then when we trigger, we decide, like the cinematic goes, well, I need these things, right? Like I need the axe to be in this hand, or I need the axe to be on my back. And so then the transition system goes, okay, I'm going to fix it all up for you before the cinematic actually starts.
Right.
Now, there might be other situations where in the cinematic itself, like when I think there's a scene where he kind of goes into the Draugr is first revealed, and he kind of turns across the corner, and then you'll see the Draugr come out. In that, when he kind of takes his axe out for the first time, that's all cinematic driven.
Right. Yeah.
And so then, in those situations, we have tags in the cinematic that go, I'm taking control of the weapon, and I've changed it into this state, right? So, but I don't know. What do you think? Like, are they?
I mean, I would have. It all really depends on the engine and on the system. I mean, for sure, I've seen a lot of games where this kind of stuff would be done actually like they would try to keep this in the cinematic itself and then actually tag that there is a state change that's happened. In some cases, it could be code, or in some cases, like you say, it could be as you're coming out of the cinematic. If you need to draw in gameplay, that there's an actual the control parameters that are driving sort of state change, like draw and holster, would actually be set to trigger at that kind of like point. So it's really using a gameplay system there that, the exact same system that you're normally using to draw and holster weapons, that you could do that kind of like a thing just as you're coming out of the cinematic.
Yeah, and what we realized is that we kind of needed multiple ways to control this. So like you've got kind of the transition system doing the handoffs. Then you've got inside of the cinematic, you've got things happening with the weapon, like scaling the weapon up a little bit, scaling it down a little bit, things like that. Like so, yeah, because I mean, in certain cinematics we really wanted to enhance, like make people really aware of Kratos' axe, but then in gameplay that would look kind of silly.
Right.
So we do like little tricks to scale the weapon up or down based on kind of the scene. And then you again have that like transition system doing the outro, where again the handoff might be cinematic or the handoff might be sort of gameplay doing the transition, because you may not want to like. Again, like the idea is you don't want to do everything for the player. You want to give the player the agency of deciding, like, hey, if I didn't happen to have the axe and the cinematic didn't need the axe, then let it be, right? Then he'll just go through the entire cinematic without the axe, and after the cinematic, if he or she chooses to recall it, it's up to him, right, or her. So I think that was kind of a neat way of kind of handling it, which is like general philosophy is like, hey, if you don't need it, don't touch it. Let the player decide.
So I've got a couple of other different types of transitions into and out of cutscenes here, which we'll sort of quickly go through. This one is what I've sort of called like O interactions, because it's like going off the kind of circle button. So in this case, I guess this is probably, there's a lot of stuff that you have to take into account, I assume, when you're going into a transition, because in this case, you're in gameplay and the player could be in any sort of position or in any kind of like sort of state, and it's sort of managing all of those, like how do you get the player to a specific sort of starting point or to a range of starting points, I guess, in order to try and kind of like make sure that you have a seamless transition into this. In this kind of case, I guess because there's a specific button prompt, it can sort of funnel you, like it can ensure that the sort of player has moved to a specific area to some degree, but I guess there's still probably alignment that has to happen because they're not going to ever be perfectly on there. And this is a thing that I guess we deal with in a lot of games, right? Like just any sort of traversal move, any kind of like time that you're interacting with a door or another player, you're having to do kind of like this sort of alignment work. So what were the kind of things that you guys were working with this?
Yeah, approach align is kind of a general, PETA sort of in most games, and we kind of had to deal with it. I think the cinematic language, again, kind of going back to that word where we had sort of like a set of templates, if you will, of like intros that we will support, right? Some are these like interact-based things where you will get a circle prompt, you press it, and then we again have the approach and align system that you'd use for any kind of door interact or pickup. It's the same system would then transition you also into the cinematic because it's kind of a very similar problem, like get the player into a specific spot with a specific orientation. And then we had sort of the traversal side of it, which is just like, hey, off a vault or off a, it's like I guess in this one, I don't know if we did a circle prompt, or like triggering it. It's more just trigger a traversal move, right?
And there you go.
And then then it like transitions into cinematic. And then we had the more complex versions where I think you have some examples of later we can look at, which is the more like walk into the cinematic.
Yeah, let's skip forward to that.
So in kind of these cases, this was a whole new ball game, right? Like where there's a lot of challenge in terms of getting the pose, the speed, the kind of narrative continuity that you'd want to maintain from gameplay all the way through into the cinematic. So if we kind of like take a step to like approach and align, right? Like that first one where it's based on an interact. My general philosophy on this is that like over the years I've started off with very much like hey, you have to be precise, right? Like get the player into a very specific spot with a very specific orientation and then execute the interact, right? And I felt like now, like, it just feels unnatural, right? Like humans are not precise. Like we don't do that, right? Especially when we're even trying to sit on a chair, we're generally pretty, we'll figure it out, but we're not going to go to a very specific spot to sit on the chair. Yeah. And so like I kind of moved over to thinking about these problems in terms of like loosen the restrictions as much as possible and correct for the error, right? So like either dynamically constantly take out or update translation or orientation as you need to, or kind of use other procedural solutions or systems like IK or something to then like deal with the delta or deal with the correction that you need, as opposed to making sure that the character goes to a very specific spot. Now I don't know if you've kind of come to similar conclusions or.
I mean, you mean specifically with kind of like
like let's say like going through a door or going through like
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I would normally sort of approach it is, if you can create like entry coverage or whatever else it is to try and, or procedural kind of like ways in which you can warp a character into a way, into a position that is kind of, is not causing foot slide or is not causing all of these kind of artifacts that we would normally kind of have, then that's great. It's just that doing that animation coverage will cost you, right? That's part of the deal. So it's kind of trade-offs really, and usually I would think of this in almost as a per move basis. Like how frequent is this type of move going to come up? Because I've worked on a lot of kind of like open world games, right, where it's not sort of necessarily staged in this sort of way. So how frequently is this going to come up? And then also, how much, okay, well, if it's only going to come up a little space at a time, maybe I could do 3 angles instead of 5 angles or something like that. And then I think also there's a lot of mileage in some of the newer systems like motion matching to be able to kind of like do a lot of this picking for you. Right. Because when you do build this grid of coverage, to try and figure out what are all the distances, what are all of the angles, what are all the states that I might be, is not just work in terms of building the animation, but it's then work in terms of kind of like figuring up all, the actual state graph system for that and all of the conditions. I think there's some stuff that we can definitely do with motion matching where it's kind of like you just drop all of that in and you get it to compare your kind of like your anchor point that's in the animation to sort of a kind of to the position that you're trying to align to and work from there. Yeah. Actually, I've got a bunch of specific kind of things I want to ask about this.
Yeah, sure.
It's really interesting. It's maybe not necessarily clear on video. I hope people kind of like played God of War. If you haven't, you should play God of War, because you really feel this on the stick a little bit. Is that the game starts to kind of like funnel you towards wherever the start position is for this kind of like sequence.
Yeah, I think you can see it really well in this one. Yeah.
So here, If I just skip forward. So when I was at this point here, I was actually pushing forward on the stick to go towards this log. So all of this movement is the actual game taking over and then pushing me into this kind of position. But in some cases, like, so, I mean, it feels very subtle. Like, a lot of it, when you're doing this, doesn't feel like you're being pushed off a collision volume or something like that. It feels as though you're very gradually being steered towards the target. And then there's obviously kind of like problems with, you know, once you actually get to the point where you then trigger the transition, you have to deal with the phase, the footstep phase that the character's on. You'd have to deal with kind of like
the speed,
making sure that there's not a very specific point where you can easily tell that that's, you can sort of see at the start of this video, I'm like edging forward just a little bit because I'm like trying to figure out where the trigger is on this. So how exactly were you sort of like funneling people in there? Because it doesn't, again, it doesn't feel like a sort of collision volume.
Right. And like you mentioned, right, like I think motion matching warrants itself really well to these problems of definitely having lots and lots of coverage of, you know, what the speeds would be, what the phase would be, and kind of have the entire sort of pose space available for finding the right kind of match. Our solution was more to predict. So we did a lot of prediction in terms of, you know, seeing where the players are going to, like, it's almost like intent prediction, right? It's like, where is the player intending to go? And then how can we then dynamically kind of influence that and then find the balance at which point we have to absolutely take over or the cinematic's going to look really bad. Yeah. And then within there, again, it's not a specific point. It's a sort of line, right? So you have like, you're walking through, let's take the example of that corner case where, you know, Kratos is kind of running off and you're kind of going now intending to be very off. Yeah. So then we'd kind of predict or we'd create sort of a very kind of wide spline. Right? And then we'd slowly start to influence you. We would determine kind of speed and distance as well.
Right.
And then as you sort of start to transition and get sucked in, you are now not going to a very specific point. You're going to kind of a line across where the cinematic will take over. Once you cross that line, that's when we start playing the cinematic. But then at that time, we're now accounting for the delta where you are now like having to correct for.
Right.
And then as we start correcting for that delta, we have to make sure that, let's say in the cinematic, you're going to touch a specific rock, or, you know, in the E3 demo where Atreus kind of goes and kind of hits a branch, we have to make sure that the delta is corrected by then. Right. So that's what then influences kind of how much warping time we have. And, you know, there's a lot of back and forth tuning on sort of what is that right balance. Right. Like at what point do players kind of feel like they're not in control anymore? And, you know, luckily enough, we're able to get it to a point where players generally, you know, like even through play tests and feedback that we've gotten, we're kind of like, yeah, it didn't bother us at all. We felt like we were just in control. We felt like we did all of that, and, you know, for the most part, it worked out. So,
yeah, it's cool. So it's awesome. It's the fact that you go all the way through the game like that.
Yeah.
is a crazy feat. I'm actually going to skip ahead now to the next topic because we're eating through our time, which is to talk about impact. So God of War has always been, like, there are a lot of games that are good at doing feedback and good at doing impact, but I think God of War has always been kind of like one of the best ones at it. So specifically, like, I mean, when I was first learning about how to do kind of like impact and animation systems and stuff, like, I was actually from the older God of War games, and really what I'd learned was kind of, you need to use almost every channel of information that's available to you in order to sell the level of impact here. So if we kind of like go back to one of these initial hits maybe, and look at what's sort of like happening here on this hit. So there's a bunch of stuff going on. The first thing is really like hit stops, right? So you guys have talked about this before. Like, I think Cory Barlog did a specific video on this. But I just like the frame timing here. This was from kind of original, I think this is inspired by sort of Street Fighter was one of the first games to kind of do this, and a lot of games kind of do this.
Yeah, I think it's like hit pause is kind of like a staple of action games,
yeah,
right? Where you really want to sell impact by like pausing the game almost for a couple of frames to sell the fact that you really have made that impact.
Right.
And then
Yeah, because you've got this big sweeping animation, and you don't know at what point in that animation you're actually going to contact with something. So to actually just kind of like pause the animation a little bit, then kind of like gives you a sense that there was actually a contact sort of made there. So as you're going through, you see this sort of frame timing here is like Kratos hits and then stops, and then you have this huge, like big contrast change, like pose change in the enemy that really sells that they've been hit. Then they're just like holding this for a second. I thought it was interesting that dynamics kept up.
Yeah, and I think that's also really important because you don't want the players to feel like, well, the game just stopped.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You really want to sell the fact that you're registering this impact, you're registering this hit, but the world is still kind of moving, right? Like time is ticking.
Right.
Right? And then giving players that like, and I wouldn't say it was like fully planned that way, but I think like the dynamics kind of really sells it. And that's why games that have capes and cloaks and like jackets and things like that really can kind of take advantage of that idea where you land and you want to sell that impact and you have the capes kind of flying around and stuff.
Right.
And it really just kind of gives you that really powerful feel for an impact.
But then, I mean, also you've got like a little bit of screen shake here that's kind of going on. You've got the particle effects that are coming out here on contact. I'm sure that there's pad vibration going on. But it's really sort of like using every channel available to you. And then even just things like the little UI, that you've got the health kind of stuff. The fact that then flashes red and goes down. That again, it's another channel of information to say a hit just happened.
Right.
So one of the questions that I had with this, though, is that in some of these cases, like with this big uppercut sort of sweep that happens here, you don't do the hit stop on this. Was there sort of like deliberate reasons for that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, like, again, it goes back to kind of finding the balance between like fluidity and impact, right? And what is the intent? So, I mean, again, Corey's vision for the axe was, it started off being extremely grounded, right? It started off as being like, we used to call it the Home Depot axe back, it didn't have a lot of magical feel to it. It was very like, grounded in like every impact had like crazy axe stick on it. And that, it started to, which was really great to kick off sort of the vision of this thing. But then it was like, well, how do we still retain that like fluidity and kind of accessibility from a players like, well, I want to launch these guys because I want to continue my combo.
Right.
Or want to juggle them. And so then we had to be like we had to decide where and when we wanted to do axe stick. And then even then, like, what's the best way to author that, right? So it's like, some of these are like actually authored animations, like for the axe sticks and very specific moves. Because again, it's about the directionality of which swing and which direction you want to go. And then some of them are procedural in just holding those frames.
Right.
And then some of them don't exist at all, kind of what you've alluded to in launches and things like that. Which we still have some, but it's not as pronounced or it doesn't last that long. And so I think again, all of those things kind of adds to like how you're mentioning kind of the impact. At the end of the day, a lot of it is just finding the right tool to match the kind of problem you have and not being afraid to do different things for different problems, right? Like I think a lot of times we try to find a one-fits-all solution, and I don't think that's the right approach, right? I think, obviously you have to look at that with balance of like how much time you have, but I think if you want the best out of every sort of individual field, you kind of have to go deeper and go, hey, maybe for this case, it's better to actually use trick A and B, and then here we should use trick X and Y. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think that's something that, again, I would encourage people to like kind of think about on a more like, what is the kind of core fantasy you want the player to have in that moment?
Yeah. It's really, it's about selling the feeling of whatever it is. I've just pulled this takedown thing. It's talking about similar sort of like stuff, but this is where you're really kind of like using, again, every channel of information possible. Like you sort of see like how light is used here. So this guy's head is a light source when when he goes
boom.
But as well, I mean, contrast is a thing that we talk about in animation all the time, right? But just like specifically that you go from, like, in 2 frames, you're going from almost nothing there to being, like, hit in the face by this kind of, like, big sort of light explosion. Again, it's sort of like, and then it's over and done quickly, fairly quickly, and he moves on with his kind of regular gameplay. But this is why it just feels very satisfying to do all of these kind of, like, things, and maybe players aren't even thinking about why exactly in the moment. So another kind of thing This isn't just restricted to sort of restricted to combat moves. You get this sort of same thing all over the place. Obviously, like games out there will do this on menu items. They'll do this on leveling up or whatever else it is. I like that this this first one is actually creating a physics impulse. So it's kind of like anything in the area that gets hit by physics can get sort of like destroyed. So sort of moving on a little bit. This is kind of related, but it's moving on a little bit.
Sure.
I wanted to talk about sort of what happens, just very briefly about kind of like how we do this impact when you aren't able to do all of the same sort of stuff in animation. So in multiplayer specifically, you don't want to interrupt whatever another player is doing. Like another player is running around and trying to shoot you or whatever else it is. And you know, unless it's sort of deeply built into the gameplay, a lot of the time you want to leave them free to do that. That means that we can't stop them and do a hit reaction in the same sort of way. So I just pulled up this thing from this gameplay from kind of like Apex, because I think it's a sort of good example of how to give kind of feedback to people even when you can't push the animation as much.
Right.
So you'd still maybe do additive animations in these kind of cases, right? But you see, they do a lot in terms of audio here, and a lot in terms of the numbers that are popping off characters here. So if I just kind of like, I don't know if this is going to play louder, but if you hear this, they have this kind of glass breaking sound, and even if you're kind of miles away, you sort of see in this kind of like next shot. This is getting a bit away from animation, so this is just going to be a quick point. If you think about where you are with a sniper rifle here and where they are, if this was a realistic, physically modeled sound, the sound of the muzzle flash would completely overpower anything that's going off in the distance, right? But here, when they shoot, you get those hit response kind of, sounds, and you get those kind of like numbers. And when somebody's this tiny on screen and you're just shooting shots down range, like, you need that to be able to say, I actually hit. But again, we're deviating away from animation here, so.
Well, I mean, like to your point, though, right? I think that's still a problem we have in other games where you have these like massive creatures that you can interrupt their attacks from, right? Like I think you had a video of like
I had a video about this.
Yeah, here we go. So there's like here you're going to be like fighting this big troll, where you can't constantly interrupt the troll's attack moves, because then the gameplay would just very quickly suffer. And so here, like this is always an ongoing challenge, and I'm curious about like ways to solve this problem, where like we double down on ideas of like a lot of blood, cuts on the leg, so those hits register. We got the health bar over there, and then we added a little procedural jiggle, is what we called it, on the knee. So you'd get like a little knee jiggle just to make sure that you kind of can register that. But I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like what do you think? Like the idea of big creatures that need localized hits without suffering from lots of twitchy reactions or whatever. Because like I feel like this is an area in games where I think we can do more. It's just the solutions aren't necessarily that available yet, maybe?
I know some people who would say, it has to be gameplay first, and that the whole point of this gameplay encounter is to have you anticipate these very big hits coming in and then use the opportunity to dodge out of the way. I think you've hit on it in terms of animation, little small additives that are not going to actually break what the character's going to do, but can maybe provide some sort of feeling of contact would help. Any sort of secondary stuff like jiggle, or I think a good thing for boss characters is like armor plates or anything that can kind of like be knocked off them, because especially if they are like a big damage sponge, then you need to have a feeling like you're actually doing something to this boss, like that it's not just a health bar that's ticking down, but you want to have them go through stages, and you can sort of see here in what you guys are doing that like you start getting these cuts and these blood splatters and things that go on the character as you're going through. And I think in some of the other boss fights throughout the game, there are specific kind of like points at which you might like really actually damage or wound that kind of change the actual state.
Switch the state. Yep. No, I agree, and I think like having again like procedural solutions to these problems is probably the way to go in my mind. It's just that I think it's important to base those procedural solutions back to base animation content. So like use your animation content as a guiding way to drive your procedural solution.
Right.
If that makes so like here, like if, for example, like the things that we've tried is like, let's say if the troll jiggle, like let animators decide how much jiggle is okay, right? Like let them decide what the kind of IK or range of how much jiggle we can allow should be given the move that they're in. So again, it goes back to like, you're gonna want a different solution for knee jiggle, but you might want a completely different solution for like head or something like that, right?
Gosh, the clock's ticking. We got so much to get through.
So maybe, yeah, maybe we should
move on.
jump to.
Move on to another game.
Cool.
Let's talk about Spider-Man, which is a fantastic game this year with some great animation. And specifically, we wanted to talk about kind of like a few different things with this, but one of them was the idea of flow. So I think what this game is, where this game really, really shines is in kind of like two areas. It's like hitting these key poses constantly. Like we've all seen Spider-Man through the years, right? Like he's been in comic books, he's been in movies, there's toys, there's everything, and there's these kind of very iconic poses that are decades old. And just looking at how his animation goes, especially when he's web slinging, he's constantly hitting these poses, and it's constantly selling like who this character is. Like, there we go, pose, and then we run forward, and sort of, you can't really see it here, kind of like, but as he's going through these swings, when he hits the bottom, he tends to kind of like hit one of these poses, and then any time that he kind of like jumps, he spins around, and but they're constantly maintaining this feeling of flow. It feels a lot like, to me, like the way that free running first worked in Assassin's Creed, where it's you just hold down right trigger and push forward, and it will continually do things. There's a lot of moves built in there in terms of being, having something to think about, having different ways to navigate around. But I don't know, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it, where it is about kind of having that fantasy of being Spider-Man and hitting these poses. I mean, from a technical point of view, I guess flow in general, from an animation point of view, to me inherently is like coverage, right? You need a ton of coverage, and then you need the appropriate sort of markup in the world, or the appropriate kind of detection to know what to do when. Right. Again, I think I'd probably say motion matching probably warrants itself well to some of these areas where you're kind of like hitting the side of the building, you're wall running, and based on what pose you're coming into. But then I think in sort of this kind of web slinging flight mode, when you're kind of just transitioning up and down, I'd probably do something that's more like code-driven movement with a lot of just animation layering on top, and then having lots of outs for if I were to hit something. So it's kind of like a reflective model where you're like, let the flow continue and then react to something that's going to disrupt the flow, right? As opposed to kind of worrying about it all the way through. I don't know if that.
I mean, I think you sort of see that the sort of nice thing when you talk about like having the outs and having the transitions. Again, to constantly sort of maintain flow. If I do something like drive this guy into a building, it very quickly maintains his momentum.
And just continues.
Kind of like move.
Right.
And I think one of the most genius kind of animations in here is the running directly up a wall. You might sort of see it a little bit further in here in the next kind of like video. Just because if you imagine you're web slinging and you just web sling straight into a wall, right? Like that's going to completely break all that.
Right.
But so long as you're holding down the right trigger, you're straight up and you keep going.
Right.
And it's just all to try and kind of like keep that.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the speed factors into this. Like if this was a slow moving thing, obviously you'd be able to notice a lot of the twitches and glitches and kind of pops in transitions. But given that there's so much camera movement happening, there's so much kind of like speed as part of this, you forgive a lot of the transitions that may seem abrupt, right? Like the idea of like swinging right into a wall and then shooting up, you kind of you believe it. And I think that's a testament to just having really well animated characters, right? Like
so I think this goes throughout the game, and so even with combat, again it's the same thing. It's trying to hit these same key poses. Like every time that he stops, he does this 3-point landing, which I know some animators try and avoid. But I think in this case, this is a pose that has been in the Spider-Man sort of like canon for years. I also wanted to just point out that when he's doing these hits, it's the same sort of thing as God of War. So you hit and then you
just hold,
do the pause, and then run through. and it's trying to sort of sell it. I guess you don't want to see a lot of blood in this, so you're getting, because it's Spider-Man, so you're getting a lot of these kind of like pops, or you get kind of like particle effects coming off these guys.
So we got the 10-minute warning from Mike.
Okay. We should skip way ahead. Like I say, I'll be putting together a video with all of this kind of like stuff, including anything that we've kind of like skipped over later, and I'll be posting that on YouTube. So,
how are we doing on the questions front, guys? Do we have a lot of questions coming in, or? All right. While we wait on that, maybe we'll jump to the next video.
So,
Can we get a brief explanation of motion matching?
Sure.
sure. Oh, do you want me to do that?
Yeah, let's have Dan take that one.
Gosh. How brief is brief? So the idea with motion matching is that it's sort of a new approach to building animation systems where traditionally the way that you would build kind of like, that you would decide which animations are appropriate to play in any particular time, is that you build almost like a flow chart called a state machine. And that's very explicitly sort of put together by an animator or a technical animator or a programmer, and has very kind of like specific conditions for like when you should move from one move to another move. With motion matching, it's really more kind of like you drop a lot of your animations into just like a giant database, and we try and offload some of that decision making into sort of code so that it's kind of for things like velocity or matching the pose of the previous move that you were doing. It will try and make some smart decisions about what to do there. I could go into it.
I think fundamentally, like a simple way to think about it is that it's constantly trying to match pose. And it's constantly trying to find the best possible frame in the animation to jump to and play as long as certain criteria or conditions are met. So it just uses sort of like a cost function to decide, you know, am I matching what I need to match, be it velocity or speed or angle or whatever. And if it goes out of those bounds, it tries to find another frame to jump to all the time, right? So it's sort of a data-heavy way of thinking about it, but it's a really smart way of not having to represent. It's a very expressive way of representing things that are very limited. If you think about, again, how the body moves and how characters in general, like it's like nobody thinks about, I'm going to do a 45 right degree turn, right? Like nobody thinks about that way. And I think motion matching gives us the ability to really just break free from that kind of rigid limitation.
Or if you have a very sort of like, like a very non-uniform type of movement, like if I step backwards and to the left while turning this way, previously to try and kind of like describe what that is, like just writing the naming convention, that would be back, left, with rifle, with this 245 to from 45 to, it means that your state graphs become very, very like dense and like this big spaghetti spider web of kind of stuff. And so the whole point when motion matching kind of originally came around was kind of to try and simplify some of that stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, there's tons and tons of online sort of resources around this stuff. So I encourage anybody that is interested in motion matching should definitely check out sort of what's available online.
So do we have other questions, or should we just do a few last?
Let's jump to the
last thing. So I put something together that was just a little grab bag of kind of like little things that I'd seen throughout kind of the year that I thought were great animations. And this is not necessarily kind of like the biggest animation in the game. It's just, originally I called this Anims That Spark Joy, just because it was kind of like things that you see that you're kind of like, oh man, I love this. Like, so the first one was the God of War Axe Throw, which I think was kind of like, you know, it was difficult, I'm sure, to come up with something that lives up to the kind of history of the Blades of Chaos and tries to kind of like stays on that kind of level. But it's just very, very satisfying to just like recall this thing to your hand from miles away. One thing that I really like is this kind of, there's like a little jiggle that kind of like happens just before he recalls, so you sort of see it here. Mm-hmm. And then like, how exactly were you guys figuring out how to get the axe oriented to the right way before it actually hits the hand?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, for lack of a better word, code magic. But I think like an important lesson to kind of point out is like, we tried so many different versions of this, and people, you know, because the more utility of the axe got more and more important, people were like, well, it has to be straight line. And then we're like, no, it just doesn't, the fantasy is not there, so we're going to curve it a little bit.
Right.
And then we tried like spinning it the whole time, which just felt noisy. So then we kind of like if you really pay attention, it'll only correct itself right at the very end. Like the last second where Kratos grabs it is when it kind of spins and orients back into frame. But yeah, no, it was a great, like, you know, again, design, programming, all really coming together with animation to really sell this one moment, which is the fantasy of the weapon. So.
So this next one, this is one of my favorite animations of the year. So Kratos can just open a chest, like, but no, he's an angry guy, and okay.
He's effective.
So,
he's effective.
sure, but when you're super strong, it's like nothing to him. But I just love it because it's a very tiny little gameplay move.
Right.
Yet even in this kind of like little corner of the game, it's like, what can we do to sell who this person is?
Yeah, like it's great, right? Like find animators again. Like animators are amazing, and it's like use every opportunity to sell who your character is, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Spider-Man, when you melee towards civilians,
Yeah, this is great.
is he gives the thumbs up. And I think we've seen a lot of this is similar to kind of like you know, whether you can pet dogs and stuff like that in games where there's no gameplay. Like, there's no mechanical sort of reason to do it in there, but it's like role play.
Right.
It's like putting these things in there where okay, well, I feel like Spider-Man. And the amount of traction this gets in the press, this kind of thing, where it's like to get eyes on your game, I think there's a huge amount of value in this. And I think, you know, when teams are kind of thinking about, well, where are we going to put our budget, there should be more of this stuff in there just to sort of help you feel like the kind of character.
Yeah, and it's just a smart way as well of dealing with that, right?
Here. The dog in Red Dead, yeah. I mean, there's a little bit more mechanical kind of like stuff here once you start dealing with kind of like horses, but it's, it just, again, it creates a connection. It makes you feel like a cowboy. It makes you kind of like feel like there's more that you can do in this world other than punch people. And
right, yeah, and I think you said it really well. Like, it is role playing. It is like, I want to be this guy. I want to do the things that like make me feel like completely immersed in this kind of cowboy fantasy, and I think they nailed that. So I think that's great.
Yep. So this other one. So I love the transition to flight. The whole flying system in Anthem is great, and David did a great talk at GDC yesterday about this. Specifically, I love the kind of like Ranger one. Just because of the amount, again, we talk about contrast, but like the amount of contrast that's built into this to like make you feel it is like, so you jump up, and in like one frame, you ball up as well. Like if you can do this at any point in the jump, but if you do it at the apex of the jump, which is where most people are going to do it, you kind of ball up. It's sort of like the bouncing ball kind of thing, right? Where you squish up at the top, but then all of a sudden, like one frame, you go from here to kind of like here.
Right.
And as well, also like notice that sort of the jump jets cool down as well. Again, if you're doing it at the apex, so it just cools down. You're starting to get dark, like your whole character's like darkly lit kind of here, and then shoots out. But I just love anything that, I really like anything where it feels like multiple departments had to really kind of like come together to make this happen. And this is like particle effects, and it's screen shake, and the way that the FOV changes on the camera makes you feel like you're being shot out of a gun or something.
Yeah.
But it's very, very satisfying to do. I do this like just for fun when I'm playing this game. Here's another one from Red Dead. This in a lot of games, they would just pop that. One frame, they would just pop that. The things on your face. But I guess they've got this haircut system where you have kind of like a completely like analog beard length.
Yeah, some
so
kind of
because
like
of that, if that's just on a float value or something,
some kind of arcade.
you just animate it to be. So it's very simple to kind of like do it, but it's just these sort of small details
Brilliant touch,
make it
right?
feel really kind of like grounded. And then I got this last one, which is just. You may recognize who this character is, actually, if you played this game, but the guy that I'm held in. But so yeah, you know, you're just minding your own business, and you're kind of like playing the game, doing whatever you're doing. I've just kidnapped this guy, and then this stuff. And then here we go. We're going to go with this. Just Rockstar's always kind of like had this sort of euphoria system or physics kind of like stuff going on. And I guess there's not a huge amount of opportunities to do it because there's no car crashes and things like that in Red Dead. But I like horses, and that's
Dan does not like horses.
But I gotta hit the audio up on this one because like these guys are like hey, hold right where you are, and then, yeah, no. But,
No, that's great. I mean, I think like physics-based animation is also something that is, it's such a great way of kind of keeping it believable, but still finding again the right balance, right? Because they could have gone crazy with this, but it's about restraint too, and finding the right like.
Yeah, they've got good limits, and he kind of like sometimes like covers himself up as he's
Right.
going down it. So it's good stuff. So I think we've hit time. I would have loved to kind of had more time to answer questions for people, but maybe we'll jump on the chat and we'll answer those. So thanks everybody
Right,
for
thanks so much.
your time, and
So back to
cheers.
Mike and Julie.